And I'm delighted that that we've got Assembly members, members of the Scottish Parliament, vets, MPs, and members of NGOs such as the Trade Justice Movement on this call. The discussion will be fairly open. I'm going to hand over in a minute to Alan Bates, who is probably the UK's expert on the Internal Market Act, and he will give you a brief introduction to that and his views on the Internal Market Act and what it does in terms of devolved nations, and how they can interact with that divergence between the reserved issues of trade and the devolved issues of animal welfare. So we're going to look at this morning, how's the Internal Market Act working? How does it manage regulatory divergence? How does it prevent trade barriers between the UK nations? And we're going to look at how the UK trade ministers coordinate between the devolveds. What's it like particularly for the farm unions? How empowered do they feel? What's it like for the elected members of the devolved nations, the Senedd, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Scottish Parliament? How do they feel that they have a vote or a voice in this particular issue? We've got an hour, and at the end, what I hope we will have is a summary of the action points, such as how to improve the involvement of the devolved nations in trade negotiations. And we will be pulling together a briefing at the end to centre all the elected members of the devolved nations, giving our views. Obviously, it's very topical at the moment. We've got the UK announced only last week. It's I think it's fifth FTA negotiation with the Gulf Cooperation Council. That is added to the Canadian FTA, the Mexican FTA, the CPTPP, the Indian FTA. We're expecting a New Zealand agreement in principle, and we're expecting the Australian full FTA to be published in the next few weeks. So there's a lot going on trade. And obviously 2 weeks ago, the English government announced its position on gene editing, that it is minded to go ahead with crop gene editing and looking at animal gene editing. And obviously there are big implications there for the devolved nations as well. So it gives me great delight to hand over to Alan Bates. Alan is a respected member of ALAW, the Association of Law and Animal Welfare, and he is also a barrister and, as I said, probably the UK's expert on the Internal Market Act. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. So I'm keen to leave plenty of time for discussion, but to get us going, what I want to do is to essentially answer 3 questions about the UK Internal Market Act. First of all, why was it needed? Why is it needed? Secondly, what does it do? And then thirdly, why does it matter for animal welfare post-Brexit? So first of all, why is it needed? Well, it's really for ensuring free trade within the UK internal market following Brexit. Now, as David mentioned, devolution within the UK means that each part of the UK has broad competencies to regulate goods, services, and methods of production. And that, of course, was also the case prior to the end of the Brexit transitional period. But whilst we were a member of the EU or during the transitional period, the fact that EU law was applicable throughout the UK ensured in practice that regulatory divergences between the different parts of the UK were quite minor, particularly in relation to standards required to be complied with for goods, and also standards in animal agriculture. And that's because the mechanism for laying down EU law throughout the EU consisted largely of directives that set out the objectives to be achieved in terms of the regulatory results, if you like, and left some freedom to the member states to lay down the detailed rules for implementing those results, but the end results were set out there. So you could have divergences between the different parts of the UK in terms of how they got to the result, but ultimately the results be achieved was laid down, and that's why the divergences were minor. Now, the Brexit transition period came to an end at the end of last year, and so the UK government felt that urgent action was needed to stop future regulatory divergences, which could raise non-tariff barriers within the UK, because there are different rules on quality of goods or how they can be marketed and sold. And of course, the fact that the end stages of Brexit were so rushed, if you like, meant that there was perhaps less time to discuss and consult on those things than might have been ideal. So we know what the objective is, to have this free trade within the UK unimpeded by non-tariff barriers. So how does the UK internal market seek to do this? Well, in relation to goods, it introduces two market access principles. The first principle is mutual recognition, and that's applicable to all goods that are produced in or imported into a part of the UK prior to being sold in another part of the UK. So the fact that it covers imported goods as well as UK produced goods means that essentially all goods, all types of goods, are within the scope of mutual recognition. And what mutual recognition means is essentially that if the goods, in terms of their substance, their quality, their means of production, meet the legal requirements in one part of the United Kingdom for being sold in that part, they can then also be sold throughout the rest of the United Kingdom, regardless of the standards that have been imposed in those other parts of the UK. And then the other market access principle is non-discrimination. And this is about rules to do with how goods are marketed and sold. So it's not about the quality of the goods themselves. And those rules must not be discriminatory against goods that have a relevant connection with another part of the UK. And that relevant connection can be because the goods were produced in another part of the UK, or the person producing them has a connection with another part of the UK. Perhaps they've got their home office in England, let's say, and their goods are being sold in Scotland. Now, a really important thing to know about the UK Internal Market Act is the unique mechanism by which it has practical effect, because it doesn't actually invalidate the laws of any part of the UK. Rather, what it does is render them of no effect in relation to certain goods. So how this works is, let's say that you've got a pork pie that's produced in England, and you want to sell it in Scotland, but it doesn't comply with the regulatory rules applicable in Scotland. Those Scottish rules are rendered of no effect in relation to that pork pie. So as long as the pork pie complies with the English rules, it can then be sold in Scotland. Now, why does all this matter for devolution and animal welfare? Well, in one sense, it doesn't, because any part of the UK can pass whatever legislation it wants. It's not invalidated in any way. But of course, in practice, there's no point in making rules that are of no practical effect or that can easily be avoided. So if you're the Scottish Parliament, there's not much point in raising animal welfare standards required for pork pies in Scotland. If anyone who wants to avoid those rules can then simply produce them in England and rely on the fact that the English rules are being satisfied for those products. For that reason, it's likely that the UK Internal Market Act will have a freezing effect in terms of keeping the existing rules for animal welfare that relate to goods pretty much the same as those that came from the EU, because it's very difficult for any part of the UK, and I include England, in fact, for this purpose, to increase animal welfare standards because of this ability of others to avoid that by complying with the rules applicable in another parts of the UK that hasn't similarly raised its standards at the same time. And of course, there's also a Northern Ireland dimension to this, because goods can come into Northern Ireland relying on EU internal market rules if they meet EU standards, and then be sold in reliance on the UK Internal Market Act across the other parts of the UK as well. For that reason, cooperation between the different parts of the UK in the animal welfare field is going to be incredibly important because of, as I said, the difficulties of one part of the UK moving first and raising its standards before the others. The Act envisages that there will be common frameworks where it's agreed on a UK-wide basis that there will be increases in standards, and it will then be possible for the UK Secretary of State to make rules excluding the effect of the Internal Market Act, where rules are imposed which reflect these common frameworks. So that's why cooperation between the different parts of the UK is going to be so important. And of course, this has a practical effect on animal welfare campaigners and farmers' unions, etc., who are lobbying for change in creating an approach to lobbying that basically shepherds the different parts of the UK into agreeing common approaches rather than ploughing their own furrows, as it were. So that's by way of introduction, David. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alan, for that clear and concise summary of the Internal Market Act. So I want to go to the politicians now in each of the devolved nations to get their views on A, how they react to what Alan's just said, and B, how they feel that cooperation and that internal communication is going at the moment. So I'm going to start off in Wales. I've got Ben Lake and Liz Saville-Roberts on the call. Ben, do you want to come in first of all?
Well, and thank you, David, and thanks also to Alan for that fantastic introduction, and I think summarised a lot of the key points that I would want to make in relation to the Internal Market Act. I think by way of my reaction, it can be summarised as, I think, a conclusion that the UK body politic, if I could be as grandiose as that, and certainly Whitehall, perhaps, after 20 years of devolution in various forms, still hasn't quite come to terms or has reconciled the practical consequences of the UK now existing as a quasi-federal state. And I know federalism can be a very difficult word for many people across the UK, but in terms of practice and the consequences of devolution and the settlement that has developed in each of the three nations that are part of England, over 20 years, has meant that actually we are well overdue a real constitutional conversation about how these things work in practice. Alan mentioned, I think, and it was right to highlight my biggest concern with the Internal Market Act, in that some of the provisions will, in effect, mean that many laws that are passed in Wales will be of no effect if some of the products originate in other parts of the UK, which perhaps have different regulations. That is fundamentally a challenge to the whole purpose of devolution and the existence of it, because if you can pass laws in Cardiff, but for a potentially large and at the moment unknown quantity of products, but we know in Wales a lot of products are imported, as it were, or transferred in from other parts of the UK. If those laws passed in Cardiff have no effect, then it poses significant and existential questions then about the purpose of the Senedd in Cardiff, which is a very serious challenge, in my opinion, and not one that the people of Wales have necessarily raised. I think that we might discuss later on about the common frameworks, and I won't go into it at this moment, but I think the need for a formalised, frequent and regular engagement between the four nations of the UK in the hope of agreeing common frameworks and ways forward is an important one. On the previous EU level, of course, I mean, harmonisation rules cover, I think, 75% of goods, so there was quite a very small number of percentage, sorry, of goods that were unregulated and were open to this sort of situation that I've just outlined as being one of my fears, and that you could have a bit of a, if not a race to the bottom, a freezing effect. You know, nobody wants to move to in any way improve or heighten standards, lest they throw their own producers into a competitive disadvantage. That again is a serious hindering of the ability of the four parliaments in the UK. And one, again, I should emphasise, is not necessarily something that public has had a proper discussion on. I'll leave it there for now, David, because I know others want to speak.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. Liz, do you want to add anything?
Very briefly, thank you, David, and thank you, Alan, as well, for that concise explanation, and also to Ben. I think I'll just add a little bit to, I think, what Ben said. I think what Alan said about a freezing effect, I think politically that probably is predictable to be true. I don't see anything actually theoretically in this that would not prevent a reduction in welfare standards. That is not utterly impossible, and I think it's worth us being alert to that. Interestingly, Ben touched upon that existential constitutional sort of series of very abstract concepts that actually do question the power of our devolved parliaments in quite fundamental ways. And I think there is a very, very significant question, which we've just touched upon actually, with these common frameworks. What are the structures going to be for those to be in operation? They're effectively a dependency at the moment on cooperation between ministers. It's a personality arrangement. There's not a formal structure there, and there is no structure whatsoever for scrutiny. And I think those really are serious questions. I'd just like to touch on one final point, which may seem a little bit tangential. We have the subsidy control bill, and it's not at all clear to me how that's going to play out in particularly public sector procurement. And if we're thinking about welfare arising from the family farm, and then the family farm dependent on wholesalers, say selling into local authorities for school dinners or to health trusts for food there may actually be a question on how that operates. I think this is going to play out, if I can just leave that as an illustration on the table for now, that this is going to play out in a whole host of unexpected ways, which will, of course, if I can go back to the fact that we need these frameworks for scrutiny, we're making this legislation extremely swiftly now. It's going to rush through. I think there's about 12 pieces of legislation this will apply to. We need to have means of not trapping ourselves in unforeseen and unintended consequences.
Thanks very much, Liz. And I should have mentioned that anyone that wants to pose questions or comments can do so in the chat. So I'm now going to go up to Scotland, to Dave Dugan. Dave, how do you feel from a Scottish point of view? Obviously, you've got a pivotal position because you're on EFRA, and you know these issues inside out. How do you feel? Is there a structure at the moment to agree that framework?
No, thanks, David. No, there's not. Well, there may be an outline structure, but what we can't escape is the fundamental disconnect within the political and bureaucratic apparatus within the UK as we have it just now. This is, let's be clear, against the backdrop of the Scottish Parliament, quite rightly, failing to issue a legislative consent for the Internal Market Bill, which has become the Act. It was done for very good reasons, and some of them were small p political, maybe some of them were large p political. I don't think so, because these are practical, operational, political matters. And what we've seen is, and I'm an engineer, standardisation is a good thing, the elimination of unnecessary variation. It's hard to argue against that. But within the confines of the UK, we have a government department in DEFRA, which is a de facto English government department. I've argued several times that George Eustace, not personally, but just because he's in the position at the moment, he isn't a Secretary of State, because the regulation that he lays down, if it was done in the correct way in accordance with the devolution settlements, wouldn't affect anything other than England. And England, like Scotland, isn't a state. But what you've got is an English government department operating as a UK government department, and that's bad enough. But you would expect and hope that in a very asymmetrical construct such as the UK is, where the second largest element of the composition, being Scotland, is 10 times smaller than the largest part, England, you would hope that the Secretary of State and the government at large would wear that imbalance lightly and work with consent, which hasn't been done. And so we've seen something forced through which is at odds. And so, but it's not just obviously political and bureaucratic operational consequences. There's real material consequences for the industry here in Scotland, and that is principally those of standards. Scotland doesn't do scale. We trade on our reputation and our brand for quality, higher cost, higher provenance, higher higher quality produce than that which is produced on the global sector. And that brand, that USP, is at risk by being rolled up in a UK standard which has the potential, certainly, to erode the base of that higher standard framework that's been developed for many, many years in Scotland. That doesn't undo the exceptional output that comes from many producers in England or elsewhere in the United Kingdom, but it takes away the ability to control for it. So, if we wanted an internal market act to apply across the UK, fundamentally, there's very little to argue against that. But the way in which it was done evidences a really very challenging environment for standards to be upheld by the departments within the devolved governments that are responsible for those. Because as was set out in the introduction, what is the point in setting your own exacting evidence-based standards consistent with your strategic ambition going forward if, as part of the United Kingdom, they count for naught when goods, raw material, raw ingredients are imported from around the world into food production facilities in England, and they are produced into food products which have got universal access to the UK internal market. It makes a mockery of devolution, and I know we're talking about animal welfare standards, but it reads right across the script. So in terms of framework, and I was on, and it's ongoing as well, David. I was on the Delegated Legislation Committee for the Animal Sentience Bill that's going through Parliament just now, and challenged Victoria Prentice on the word consultation, which occurred many times throughout the draft legislation, but no consent. And so, yet again, there was no legislative consent from the Scottish Government, and the Welsh Government and the Senate have gone further than the Scottish Government on that particular issue to say this is not right for Wales. And Victoria Prentice's response to that was, well, there's been an ongoing discussion about whether this is devolved or not, and we've proceeded on the basis that it's not. So that's what you're up against when you're dealing with this current UK government, and it should be a concern to everybody that sees the future of UK agriculture as being based on the highest possible standards.
Great, thanks very much, Dave. Right, I'm going to go to Northern Ireland. Obviously, the protocol is hugely in the news today. There are meetings today to look at this, so it's an ongoing issue. But I'm going to go to John Blair, who's on the Committee for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in the Northern Ireland Assembly and chair of the Northern Ireland APPG for Animal Welfare. John, you have the floor.
Yeah, and I will apologise, David, that I'm going to have to be very brief, as I have a meeting about to start soon on the Healthy Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Committee, starting slightly earlier this morning, so I will apologise for that. But look, thanks to all of you for the opportunity. I'm sure you'll be aware of the very unique circumstances of Northern Ireland, of course, and then we have to consider the issue that the Internal Market Bill has been described by many, including colleagues of my own, as a power grab in relation to Northern Ireland and the devolved powers as well. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, which we have to consider very seriously and set them clearly in the context of Northern Ireland's unique position. And the unique position is based on the proportionality of agriculture and the agri-food sector in relation to our local economy and, of course, all of the more minor local economy in all of the areas across Northern Ireland. The protocol itself, of course, and I think at this point, in relation to the latest proposals from the EU, we'll have to just accept that we're still working our way through those and also waiting for the considered positions of the parties across the spectrum to those proposals. And I think coming days will make that picture a little clearer. There's also the serious issue in Northern Ireland of cross-border cooperation, cross-border trade, cross-border animal movements, workforce movements across that border. It's important not to forget that families, workers and others, traders, cooperate and operate across that Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland border on a daily basis. And those are factors that cannot be ignored. And in addition to that, it can't be ignored that the absence of devolved government in Northern Ireland for a period of 3 years has had a considerable effect on animal welfare legislation in terms of not being quite up to speed in some areas with the other regions. And you will know that the absence of Stormont for political reasons for 3 years created problems in that regard. And it's not helpful at this moment that that's being threatened again, excuse me, by some. But we have to work in an atmosphere of hoping that that does not happen and that we can continue to react to the current situation, developing situations, and also continue to legislate for the trading arrangements and for other reasons.
Thanks very much, John. So I'm now going to go to the representatives of the farmers in each of the three devolves, because obviously you have to produce the food to the standards that the individual country wants, and obviously you hope that your products will be able to be sold not just in the UK but overseas as well. And how much do you feel that you have a voice in this, and how confused are you in terms of where your standards should be? So I'm going to come first of all to, I'm going to stay in Northern Ireland. Wesley Ashton, who's the CEO of the Ulster Farmers Union, has unfortunately had to go to another meeting, which is understandable today because of the protocol issues. But we still have David Brown from the Ulster Farmers Union on the call. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Deputy President. Sorry you've had to do for second best here, but I'll cover, I suppose, some of those issues which are very specific to Northern Ireland. I suppose the key issue for the Ulster Farmers Union has always been to ensure that our standards weren't going to be undermined, while recognising, I guess, that the UK government was going to open and liberalise its approach. And, you know, that's been part and parcel, I suppose, of those discussions. And I understand, David, you were alongside Wesley in some of those TAC meetings. But I guess, to be fair, you know, the fact that scrutiny is not, I mean, there was proposals of a statutory TAC, and we're disappointed that those 6 months later have not been yet delivered, because I think currently, and I mean very topical at the minute, and I'll come back to some of the points that Alan just made, was, you know, in terms of labelling, country of origin, food service and all of that. I mean, the EU expectations on us, even just yesterday, have in effect basically been adjusted. Whether that's acceptable to the UK or not remains to be seen, of course, but or indeed to our own politicians. But in reality, you know, the point, I suppose, that makes Northern Ireland a different place in one sense is the fact that we remain within the EU regulatory zone. So therefore, you know, anything that is not up to that standard, and I suppose going back to Alan's point about the pork pie, it's a pretty topical one. We've heard about the sausages for months now on end, and the ability of food and so forth to come across from GB. That is where the real sticking point has been, from GB into Northern Ireland. So while it is true to say that, you know, anything that can be sold in England can then be sold in Scotland, it's certainly not the case that that's as simple and as straightforward when it comes to Northern Ireland, and the standards that would have to be remain here are going to be those EU regulatory standards. That in itself, you know, has created difficulties, which obviously the both Maris Sefcovic and indeed the UK, Lord Frost, are continuing to work through. I think the other thing to point out in relation to part of that protocol agreement and commitments from the UK government are that while Northern Ireland can obviously remain within that ability to export into the EU because our standards won't be allowed to diverge, that divergence can, and gene editing has been mentioned, those divergences there's an inevitability about them because what was the purpose of Brexit if you cannot diverge? So therefore, it is going to create difficulties for us. I seen a question there earlier in the chat from Phil around, animal health and medicines, and indeed even, relating, aside from this issue of welfare, the climate related issues that are very much to the fore in terms of ensuring that our high standards in that respect are maintained and we don't just export our food production. But the last point I want to make is just the fact that it's very clear that Northern Ireland has unfettered access to the GB marketplace, and that is something that we've had a concern around, is something we've raised at the highest level of government, off the back of the fact that potentially Northern Ireland could become a backdoor in that stuff, and I'll use that term very broadly, of a lesser standard that can make its way in through ROI and into Northern Ireland, in effect can be shipped across. So there are complications and difficulties there, which are very specific to Northern Ireland. They have been kicked down the road effectively because the protocol in its other aspects has been difficult to work with. It's been difficult for us as farmers to work with. And indeed, I suppose those that we represent would see the difficulties rather than the positives. So there was an expectation, I think, perhaps with our GB colleagues, that Northern Ireland had arrived in a sweet place, but I would describe it more as no man's land. And that in itself has created many concerns. And I'm sure that's where Wesley's headed off to enter into those discussions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. So I want to try and focus on solutions, or what would you like, because we've had a lot of the problems here. So what would you like to be the position going forward? And I'd like to now to go to John Davis in Wales, who's probably got the best background picture, and it reminds us what we're all talking about here. John, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and it's a real pleasure to be with you from the hills of the Epping here this morning. And obviously our Scottish counterpart talked about the quality products that you produce, and obviously it's about walking the walk here in Wales. And you'll see behind us there some of the best beef in the world, Welsh black cattle. They've trod the hills of Wales for many centuries, and I encourage you all to take part and partake in top quality Welsh food. So there's a couple of things we have as a very clear vision and ambition in NFU Cymru, and obviously COP26 is coming up. Environment's really, really important, but here today we're here to talk about animal welfare and how trade deals can impact and lead on that kind of thing. And there are plenty of opportunities within the WTO rules to do that. And part of the work we did on the TAC actually outlined those opportunities to do that. So, where we need to strengthen here, David, I would say, is about setting mandates to start off with. If we consider the Crag Act, it's incredibly poor in terms of scrutiny. If you look how America and Canada scrutinize their trade deals, Quebec has a veto within its trade deal negotiations. I think we need to really look at those approaches, because these are absolutely vital to rural Wales. The impact of poor trade deals on the economy of Wales can be very, very serious. Not only the economy, the communities, language and culture. So it's absolutely vital we get this right. In terms of engagement, we've had a reasonable level of engagement with UK government. In terms of influence, I would say it's been limited. We're early on in this process. I've said before, it's like my local rugby club playing the All Blacks. We never envisaged being outside the EU when powers were devolved to Cardiff, Belfast and Scotland. So there are no references to that in trade deals and how we influence and scrutinize those. So, there's a lot of strength that needs to be done here, and we have little time to do it. Because one thing we can't do if we're going to do things effectively, is rush things, you know, and we've really got some lessons to learn here. So, you know, animal welfare, really, really important, you know, but we're going to have to find better ways of lifting the bar here and influencing things effectively across the world, which are there within WTO rules. Thank you, David. I'm sorry to be rushed.
No, that's great. Thank you, John. And thank you also for giving two clear directions. One is on the trade deals and the scrutiny, and you mentioned the lack of transparency in the CRAG process, so actually trying to make sure that that we have a voice in what is being negotiated and what then comes out and is agreed by Parliament. And as everybody knows, probably on this call, that the CRAG Act does not really give Parliament a veto on any trade legislation. So in other words, once the trade deal is done and it is presented to Parliament, it is pretty much a fait accompli. You can't really get rid of it. And the other issue is on the Internal Market Act and its implications on devolved standards. No, I'm now going to throw it open. I've got a number of people that have asked to talk. I also, just to let the vets know, I've got a real plethora of vet experts on the call, so I'm going to come to you in a minute as well. But firstly, and Dave, John, you mentioned the TAC, and Simon has put in the chat what's happened to the TAC, and I think that's a very good question, and I think that summarises the friction between DEFRA and DIT at the moment. Obviously, we have a new DIT Secretary of State, and I think there needs to be, just about a week ago, it was the 7th month anniversary of the TAC's report, which they still have not replied to. And that is important because that is the TAC set the government a crucial exam question. How will you ensure common standards and equivalency going forward, and what will you do to protect our core standards? And that is the exam question the UK government has yet to answer. And when they do, I think that will give us a much clearer direction. But I'm going to come first to Tim Morris, who's going to talk about implementation. Tim, you have the floor.
Yes, and whilst you might be slightly surprised to see a picture of horses in the background, in terms of agricultural trade, and especially, for example, with Northern Ireland, there's been a massive impact, a 50% reduction in a high value movement. So it's not only farm livestock, and thoroughbred breeders do call themselves stud farmers. The comment I'd like to make is really on attention, and this is really the tension between the proper political issues, but my experience when working on disease control is that DEFRA, and I'm a member of the Animal Health and Welfare Board for England, but DEFRA brings together in its UK role the coordinating issues either for an outbreak or for prevention. And when you go and talk to the primary producers who operate on the ground in an integrated market, both in terms of regionally across the borders and England, Wales, but also wider, they tend to be very, very pragmatic. In other words, they are looking for, and it's very interesting, I was about to say UK-wide response, but actually more subtly, it tends to be an island-wide response. They both recognise the role of Northern Ireland in the UK, but on the island of Ireland, and then the island of Britain, they recognise that as well. So this isn't to create controversy, it's just that my experience on the ground is that there is also a pragmatic desire of primary producers to make it work and make it harmonised, and there's a tension there between individual administrations and these cross-border activities which are embedded in the current model of UK agriculture.
Thanks, Tim. That's a helpful point. So I'm going to come to the vets. You're responsible, obviously, for signing off any certification that's needed. You've been very clear that the amount of certification has increased enormously and will continue to increase. But you're also have a really good view of what's happening on the farm at the coalface and where standards are going. So Romain Pitsey, I'm going to come to you first of all from Scotland, because we haven't heard a Scottish view for a while. You gave evidence to the Scottish Environment Committee a couple of weeks ago on this issue. Do you want to say anything?
I mean, I think on the greater issues, I'll defer to James. He's much more current and involved. Okay, I think from the evidence.
Sorry, we're having problems. I don't know whether we can't hear you completely, Romain. I don't know whether you want to try again.
Yeah, my internet connection here is not good, but I think I'll defer to James on this. I mean, I think pretty much what I gave in evidence. We just, from what feedback we Scottish government, is that they were disappointed with the lack of engagement from their side. So they were equally frustrated. But I think James has a much broader perspective than me.
Okay, thanks, Romain. So James, I'm going to bring you in now for the BVA position.
Thanks, David. And John, you mentioned you're Welsh Blacks. I'm joining you this morning from BCVA Congress down in Newport. And whilst we haven't enjoyed any Welsh beef yet, we did enjoy some Welsh lamb last night. So it's great to be here. But if I may, I'd like to pick up on the sort of two sides of what we've talked about here, both the internal and the sort of more outward facing trade deal side. And I'm not, if it's okay, David, going to touch too much more on what's happening at the coalface. I think you are aware, and we've reported it a number of times, just what the pressures are in terms of capacity there. And the data that we've collected, which would suggest that if we included certification over to Northern Ireland, that by the end of August this year, so January to the end of August this year, we had 240 years worth of OV time devoted to signing certificates for keeping food moving. But in terms of picking up some of the points that have been raised this morning, the Internal Market Act, look, it's got to regulate the divergence post-Brexit and prevent trade barriers between UK nations. So I think we'd be keen to understand a bit more about what it means for devolved administrations in setting their own animal welfare and environmental standards as that relates to international trade deals, because we don't at the moment see the roles for the elected members of those devolved nations, especially given, as has been alluded to already this morning, the UK Parliament does not really have much opportunity to shape those negotiations. So, feeding into that then, how are the views of farmers and consumers in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland being heard? We're over in Northern Ireland next week meeting with stakeholders and MLAs and others. And I think it'd be really good if we could understand how we need to work together to ensure the success of that. Because if we look more externally, to date, there has been no engagement. Let's be really clear about that. There's been no engagement with us as the body that represents the experts in animal health and welfare, as well as you've said, David, those responsible for implementing the SPS requirements that the trade deals are going to include. And I think, as well as providing the expertise there, we can bring together the skills of all the people you see around the screen today, our branch presidents and our branch officers, to ensure that we don't end up with any unintended internal consequences. So we are disappointed that engagement's been so limited. We are disappointed at the delays in implementing the updated TAC, as Simon said. That was agreed previously that was needed to give oversight of health and welfare to those agreements. So our plea is for government to find better mechanisms to hear for that expertise from across the UK. And as a starting offer from us, as I've said, our branch officers are here. Justine and I are here as UK officers, and we'd be really keen to meet with MPs and representatives from devolved legislators anytime to identify how we can make sure that health and welfare is fitted into these agreements.
Great, thank you very much, James. I'm going to come, before I come to some others, I'm going to come to Alan first of all. There's been a couple of questions on the Internal Market Act. The first is that this applies presumably to not just to animal welfare, which is obviously the main topic that we're discussing today, but also to food safety and environmental regs and animal health. That's correct, yes?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Thank you very much. So now I'm going to come to some of the others. Kat McLaughlin from the NFU. Kat, you have the floor.
Thank you, David. First of all, thank you. This is a really interesting session, so congratulations and well done. So from the NFU, just wanted to let you know that we recently set out our response to the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee inquiry. You want your teeth in when you say that, on the scrutiny of trade deals. And I just wanted to let you know some of our key points and asks. I have to say I haven't heard anything that disagrees with what we've basically said. So I think we're all talking from the same message this morning. So the key point for NFU is that we think that the devolved government should have an absolute role in setting the mandate for negotiations. And we absolutely agree that this should be close consultation throughout both the discussion and implementation of deals. We've got 3 key asks that we put forward in our submission. So the first is that we think it's vital that all forthcoming trade deals include safeguards that mean overseas competitors who derive competitive advantage from production practices that are illegal or otherwise considered unacceptable in the UK will not be given access to UK markets. We also want the government to set out a clear and explicit process for properly assessing the impact of FTAs, both ahead of negotiations and as they are implemented. But one of the 4 that our next kind of key asks, and it's the really big one for us really, is that we want the government, we say that it must publish its response to the TAC report of March 2021, which I don't think we've got yet. And in particular, we would want to see how it would intend to develop to balance its ambition of pursuing a liberalising and independent trade policy with the assurances we've been given not to compromise our high standards of production. In particular, the TAC report spoke of the need for government to set out a list of core standards that would be safeguarded. And we think that it's vital that the government sets out how it intends to incorporate those recommendations into the forthcoming deal, especially with the likes of Australia very much at the front of mind at the moment, but also other countries as well to uphold environmental, animal welfare and food safety standards. We would expect this to include the safeguards that I've talked about before, that mean that overseas competitors who derive competitive advantage from production practices will not be given access to UK markets. So we are asking that really quite clearly. And we'd hope that the government will respond positively to the numerous recommendations aimed at improving UK export performance and agri-food that are aligned with our own proposals for an export strategy. So that's very much kind of our consistent key asks of government at the moment. But as I say, you know, I absolutely, I think Tim Morris's point about, you know, kind of on the ground pragmatism, yes, I absolutely recognise that as well. It is something that I think, you know, kind of does get reflected. Whether it gets listened to, I think, is a different matter. And as I say, I haven't heard anything that I think NFU would disagree with at the moment. So thank you for giving me this chance, David.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. I was talking. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I was talking to one of your colleagues in Manchester on your stand, and he said the TAC, the new TAC, could be imminent. Is that your view?
Yes, we're still hearing that it could be imminent, but what imminent means, I don't know, and I wouldn't like to say.
Yeah, no, that's very clear. Yes, I mean, it's always interesting to look at government messaging, isn't it? Imminent becomes soon, becomes next week, and it's yes, it's. But we've heard imminent for the last few months, haven't we? Really?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kat. I'm going to come to Phil Stocker. Phil, obviously you were your members are going to be impacted hugely by the Australian deal with the tariff reduction over the next, I think it is 15 years to zero. I just wanted to get your view on how you feel included or not included from not just from the trade deals, because I think everybody has expressed the frustration on the trade deal stuff, but on the Internal Market Act issue. Phil, you have the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, David. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I won't repeat everything that everyone else has said so far, because we agree with all of that. I mean, the lack of speed that has been behind the TAC has been fairly shocking. I think the lack of engagement with the devolved nations in a lot of policy development since Brexit has been shockingly bad. You know, we're a UK-wide organisation, but we're very active in all of the devolved nations. And as we've the point that I wanted to raise really, it relates to the point that I made in the chat, is that you know, animal welfare and animal health and food safety and the environment to an extent as well are all really closely interlinked. So all of these things connect together, and I've just noted two examples where that raise really interesting questions. We've been working with the Food Standards Agency in Wales for some years around the development of protocols to produce skin-on-sheep products, smokies, commonly known as smokies, for the West African market. And presumably now this would allow Wales to move forward with accepting the protocols for smokies, which they've been very supportive of, and simply sell those products into some large West African markets in England. And there's nothing that the Food Standards Agency in England could do to stop that, and there's nothing that DEFRA could do to stop that, presumably. And the other really practical issue that I wanted to raise was about Northern England and the connection between the IMA and the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the higher standards that Northern Ireland have had for a long time now on medavisna for sheep. And again, presumably, I guess the Northern Ireland Protocol overrides the Internal Markets Act, but this suggests to me that there's nothing that Northern Ireland could do now to require MV accredited stock to come into Northern Ireland. We're just going through a process where stock going into Northern Ireland from GB are going to have to be not just MV accredited, but also Scrapie accredited as well. But this raises some huge question marks over that interplay between the IMA and the Northern Ireland protocols.
Thank you very much, Phil. And I'm actually, Alan, I'm going to put you a bit on the spot, because we started off with you, and I want to finish off with you from a couple of legal opinions. So a couple of questions to you. Does the Northern Ireland Protocol override the Internal Markets Act, as Phil has just espoused? And secondly, as a lawyer, what do you think under the Internal Markets Act should happen? Because everybody on this webinar has all agreed that there needs to be better communication, there needs to be more transparency. What would you feel would be the way to achieve that, Alan?
Right. Well, on the first question, the whole topic of how the Northern Ireland Protocol interacts with the Internal Markets Act is one of huge complexity, but it's dealt with within the Internal Market Act, and I wouldn't present it as the Northern Ireland Protocol overriding the Internal Markets Act for that reason. But it's certainly necessary to look at the two things in tandem, because clearly once goods come in, certainly to Northern Ireland lawfully, they can then be marketed elsewhere in the UK. It doesn't necessarily work the other way round, where there would be a conflict with the with EU rules. On the question about sort of where we go from here and solutions, that's clearly again a huge one. But it seems to me that a key issue is the interrelationship between the Internal Market Act and trade deals, which many people have already touched on. And clearly much progress is being made with the trade deals agenda. And there is an interaction with the Internal Market Act. It's not simply that, of course, goods that come into the UK lawfully because of the trade deal will be able to be sold in the UK, but also because once they're lawfully imported into a part of the UK, those goods will then be able to rely on the Internal Market Act as well. So the effect of the trade deal may actually be given a added force by the Internal Market Act, because, for example, rules about point of sale labelling, which normally wouldn't be covered in trade deals. So let's say that in the shop, there's a rule that in the shop there has to be a sign saying, this product is produced in a certain way overseas. That sort of national rule wouldn't normally be caught by an international trade agreement, but because of the Internal Market Act, the non-discrimination provisions of that would apply. So I think for those reasons, what we need is political pressure on certainly the UK government, but generally across the UK, so that developing animal welfare standards and understanding what our overall objectives are for moving forwards in animal welfare in the UK is agreed at a UK-wide level. And that requires, I think, some new mechanisms that involve politicians from the different parts of the UK, so that there can be that unity of approach. And as I said earlier, that's envisaged within the Internal Market Act with these common frameworks. It's just that not much has happened in practice for progressing it.
Great, thank you very much, Alan. As normal, very eloquent and excellent summary of where we need to go on this. So we're coming to the end of this webinar, and I think the main take homes that I've got is not only is there a huge outbreak of unity amongst the producers, the politicians, the vets, the stakeholders on this particular issue. But there is also a huge frustration as well with not moving forward. I think there's two areas that we've touched on. The first is on the trade deals and the lack of transparency and the need for further interaction on that, which is obviously hopefully going to go forward with the TAC, the new TAC, once that's reported. But I think we have to accept that the CRAG Act will not be changed, and therefore we will always have that lack of transparency, and the power will always be with DIT as the Trade Ministry doing those negotiations. And the second issue, which was touched upon by James and others, is we really need a better mechanism for the people that have to implement this, whether that is the vets or the farmers, or indeed the politicians in the devolved administrations, to get involved at a much earlier stage and let people know about what the consequences of some of these actions will be. Alan has given us a bit of a light at the tunnels to say that there are mechanisms under the Internal Market Act to do that. And I think we need to exploit those. So I'd just like to finish off by thanking all of our speakers for their very eloquent and useful contributions. Dave Dugan, Ben Lake, Liz Saville-Roberts, John Blair, David Brown, John Davis, all the other speakers, particularly obviously Alan for his views on everything. I'd also like to thank Marissa for pulling all this together. Marissa, when she came to me this morning, she said she was really worried that we would have vast amounts of nobody speaking, and we haven't had that at all. In fact, we've had too much an outbreak of consensus. And some really good points being put together. Going forward, Talk will look at what has been said here, and we'll look at producing a common position, which we probably circulate to all of you, and we will put that into government as well, because I think with this outbreak of consensus here, there is some real opportunities for all of us to work together. So I'd finally like to thank everybody for participating. Have a really good rest of the day, and good morning. Bye-bye.